given our current legal and regulatory framework. To be sure, this initiative will not solve all our economic ills. Amending these economic provisions is one complementary strategy to unlock the country's economic potential. Let me emphasize that we only reap the benefits I mentioned if we also address the other problems involving high energy costs, inadequate connectivity infrastructure, slow bureaucratic processes, inconsistent local and national regulations, and highly concerning learning poverty and malnutrition. Conversely, a policy environment promoting openness to foreign investment can exert more significant pressure on the government to urgently address the complex challenges I have mentioned. In conclusion, I urge our legislators to proceed with deliberation and prudence in considering these amendments. Let us work together to ensure that any of the changes we make are not only responsive to the needs of our time, but also serve as the foundation for a more prosperous, resilient, and inclusive future for all Filipinos. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary Balisacan. Floor Leader.
Next resource person to be recognized, Speaker, is Yusek Seno Ronald Abencio, Chief Economist from the Department of Finance.
The Chair would like to recognize Yusek Seno Ronald Abenoa, Chief Economist, Department of Finance. You have the floor.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Your Honor. Good afternoon to the Honorable Speaker and our Honorable representatives, as well as our colleagues in government and our stakeholders in the private sector. The current review and proposed amendments in the 1987 Constitution is an opportunity to liberalize certain sectors which could attract more foreign direct investments. In general, looking at the experience of countries over the years, countries with liberalized and investor-friendly policies have experienced substantial gains in foreign direct investments. And in looking at those experiences, we can see that the acceleration in the inflow of FDIs have resulted in multidimensional benefits, including faster economic growth, possible technology transfers, improvements in human capital development, and even increase in tax revenues for the host country. The DOF acknowledges the importance of assessing the proposed amendments to the economic provisions of the 1987 Constitution to support the opening up of specific sectors and contribute to the country's medium to long-term economic growth and development. We would like to emphasize that the review could concentrate on certain economic aspects, including in the areas of public utilities, mass media, advertising, education, and mining, but could exclude land ownership liberalization. In line with this, the DOF proposes the outright deletion of foreign restrictions in the areas of educational institutions, mass media, and advertising. This effort to fully liberalize and lift such restrictions contribute to a policy environment that will make the economic regime more adaptable and responsive to current social and economic realities. It will also send a clear signal to the international community that the Philippines is open for business, making way for foreign investments. It is hoped that the inflow, the liberal foreign ownership rules would stimulate economic productivity, growth, employment generation, and promote healthy competition. Second, the DOF is also proposing the insertion of the phrase "unless otherwise provided by law" to the provision on the public utilities, as well as the nationality requirement for co-production, joint venture, or production sharing for the exploration, development, and utilization of natural resources, as in the case of mineral resources. This will give Congress the flexibility to enact laws that would free up the economy to foreign investors. This is a subtle approach and could provide more discussions on the direction of the liberalization. Lastly, we would like to highlight that the challenges being encountered by our country in attracting FDIs does not solely be attributed to the existing restrictive economic provisions. This is in recognition that there are other factors that are also important in attracting foreign investments, including, for example, improving the ease of doing business, as well as the governance environment in the country. Macroeconomic stability, as well as sustained investments, both on physical infrastructure and on human capital, is also important, as emphasized by our NEDA Secretary. In view thereof, the DOF would like to emphasize that these discussions on the amendments to the 1987 Constitution will form a part, or should form a part, of a broader package of measures aimed at enhancing and drawing more investments in the country. It is hoped that we can get more private sector support in getting the transformation of the economy to become more sustainable, inclusive, and more beneficial to our countrymen. We end our statement here, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yusek Seno Ronald Abenoja, Chief Economist of the Department of Finance. Floor Leader.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we recognize the Honorable Attorney Agaton Teodoro Overo, Assistant Secretary of the Department of Trade and Industry.
The Chair would like to recognize Assistant Secretary Agaton Teodoro Overo, Assistant Secretary, Department of Trade and Industry. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, honorable members of this Congress, fellow public servants, colleagues from the private sector, good afternoon. In the words of Secretary Fred Pascual, DTI stands with a call to amend the economic provisions of the 1987 Philippine Constitution. This is not a call for relinquishing our national interest, but rather a strategy to align with the inevitable global economic currents. It is a call for practicality, openness, and strategic action to empower the Philippine economy to reach its full potential. The proposed amendments to the 1987 Constitution are expected to result in more foreign direct investment, international education, globally competitive mass media, international advertising, and modern utilities. Increased investments expand the economy and create jobs. Access to world-class education and research facilities nurtures a culture of innovation, entrepreneurship, and creativity among Filipino students, teachers, and researchers. Allowing for foreign participation in mass media allows more convergence of media, information technology, and telecommunications industries. Collaboration with global counterparts enriches local expertise, refines skills, and positions the Philippines as a hub for creative excellence in advertising. The amendments to the Public Services Act, Retail Trade Liberalization Act, and Foreign Investments Act are considered game changers. However, FDI restrictions are enshrined directly in the Constitution rather than in an investment law or sectoral legislation. DTI supports the amendment of the economic provisions of the 1987 Philippine Constitution to enable the country to adapt and respond to current and future socio-economic conditions. This support is driven by a collective desire for economic and social transformation that will accelerate the uplifting of the lives of all Filipinos. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ASEC Ubero. Floor Leader.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we recognize the Honorable Romeo Bernardo, Monetary Board Member of the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas.
The Chair would like to recognize Mr. Romeo Bernardo, Monetary Board Member, Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. You have the floor.
Good afternoon, Honorable Speaker, Honorable Deputy Speakers, Honorable Members of the House of Representatives. The Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas maintains its view on the proposed economic amendments to the 1987 Philippine Constitution as stated in its position papers dated 12 September 2014, 6 December 2016, and 29 November 2019, submitted to the House of Representatives during the 16th, 17th, and 18th Congress, respectively. In particular, from an economic perspective, we continue to support the easing of equity restrictions on foreign participation in the economy. The BSP has supported the government's pursuit of structural reforms over the past decades, particularly those aimed at strengthening the country's growth prospects. These reforms help stimulate the economy, generate more jobs, facilitate the efficiency of public services, and improve competition by fostering a level playing field for investors. We will continue to support such measures. Based on BSP's responsibility and objectives, BSP supports efforts that will promote inclusive economic growth of the country, including, among others, easing restrictive economic provisions in the 1987 Constitution. BSP believes that reducing, if not removing, restrictive provisions will facilitate increase in foreign capital investment and hasten the growth of the economy, which in turn can expedite the ability of the nation to realize inclusive economic growth. The frequently perceived wisdom underlying the proposal to amend or revise the Constitution is that it gives the nation the opportunity to be responsive to the changing times, enables it to steer towards the direction it envisions. Excuse me. The scope and extent of international trade and commerce have dramatically increased over the last 4 decades, and so have the scale and sophistication of the global and domestic economy and financial system. In this regard, we believe that there may be room to consider the amendments to the economic provisions of the Constitution in order to make the Philippines more competitive and allow our laws to keep pace with recent and future developments. These proposed amendments to the economic provisions of the Philippine Constitution are in line with the government's efforts and measures to address major challenges in attracting foreign investment that in turn help achieve growth and financial resilience. To fully realize the economic benefits of such amendments, it would be instructive to advance policies that would enable domestic industries to develop and enhance their productivity. In closing, we reiterate that the BSP remains ready to work with Congress in pushing key reforms to facilitate an enabling investment environment towards furthering the country's economic growth and development. Salamat po.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bernardo. Floor leader.
Mr. Chairman, I move that you recognize Mr. Calixto Toti Chichamco, President of the Foundation for Economic Freedom.
The chair would like to recognize Mr. Calixto Toti Chiquiamco, President, Foundation for Economic Freedom. You have the floor.
Honorable Speakers and Deputy Speakers, Honorable Congressmen, we, the Foundation for Economic Freedom, have been continuously advocating for the removal of the restrictive economic provisions, particularly the foreign equity caps and the Filipino First provisions, enshrined in the 1987 Constitution that have hampered the economic growth and development of the country. We believe that lifting these restrictive provisions, while not a magic pill to solve our economic challenges, can nevertheless generate net benefits for the economy for the following reasons. First, removing the restrictive economic provisions in our Constitution is necessary to address the uncertainty and unpredictability of our laws. While there is foreign capital coming into the country, especially because of liberalization reforms like the amendments to the Public Service Act, the Trade Liberalization Act, and the amendments to the implementing rules and regulations of the Renewable Energy Act, these legislative changes are still subject to challenges that may render them ineffective. For example, there are currently 2 Supreme Court challenges to the amendments to the Public Service Act to date. Pending the resolution of these challenges, the legal framework on investments in this sector remains unpredictable. Second, eliminating the restrictive economic provisions in the Constitution is also necessary to allow for greater flexibility and agility in policymaking, so we can adapt to evolving economic needs and realities in both domestic and global settings. It must be noted that the Philippines is alone in having economic restrictions in its constitution. Other countries have their restrictions through policy and legislation, providing them the flexibility to adapt quickly to maximize opportunities. To be able to compete, we must be flexible enough to quickly adjust to relevant economic conditions through policy and legislation as the need arises, not through the difficult to change restrictions provided in the Constitution. Third, we must clearly signal to foreign investors that we're open to investments to attract more quality foreign investments. Removing the economic restrictions from our Constitution will send this signal loud and clear. Fourthly, the removal of the restrictive economic provisions will facilitate real competition to the entry of more players. In fact, even just the threat of competition will force existing players to behave and to compete knowing that there is a possibility of new market players entering the country. It should be noted that Philippine markets remain the most concentrated among its neighbors. Such a high market concentration shows that the restrictions have only benefited the oligarchy. For example, the entry of Starlink and other players motivated local telco companies to improve their infrastructure and services offered to consumers. Local telco companies increased their capital spending and offered satellite-based services essential to those in remote areas. By lifting these restrictions, competition will be fostered, leading to better opportunities and services for all Filipinos. Finally, I would like to advance a political argument. This is my personal opinion, not as President of the Foundation for Economic Freedom. When President Bongbong Marcos was elected with the largest ever mandate in 2022, it indicated that the people wanted systemic change and that the 1987 Constitution had failed to live up to the expectations of the people. And Marcos back to power is the very antithesis of the people power revolution. The people were sending a message. Don't get me wrong. The 1987 Constitution restored democracy, and we should be grateful for that. However, its Filipino first and Filipino only ideology has failed as an economic model and has failed to uplift the lives of the people. Just as the election of Milei in Argentina showed that the Argentinian people wanted a dramatically different direction from Peronismo, the election of President Bongbong Marcos shows that the people want a different direction from the Filipino first and Filipino only ideology in the 1987 Constitution. You, as politicians, must listen to the political message that the people are giving. The people want to move in a dramatically different direction. In conclusion, we emphasize that amending the restrictions in the 1987 Constitution is not an end-all and be-all solution. Factors such as lack of infrastructure, expensive power rates, high logistics costs, and red tape continue to deter FDIs. Nonetheless, amending the restrictive provisions is a necessary first step to create a more conducive investment environment. Amending the Constitution to show the Philippines' commitment to investments need not be mutually exclusive with enacting policies and reforms that aim to improve the rule of law, address corruption, enhance the ease of doing business. The two can be addressed at the same time to attract much-needed investments, to generate the capital to build infrastructure, and to acquire the necessary technology to ensure that Filipinos get improved basic services. Removing the restrictions in the Constitution is the first among many necessary steps to place the Philippines at par with the legal framework of our more competitive ASEAN neighbors. For these reasons, we strongly advocate for amending the restrictive economic provisions in our Constitution. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you very much, Mr. Toti Chiquiamco. Floor leader.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we recognize Mr. Sunny Africa, the Executive Director of Ibon Foundation.
The chair would like to recognize Mr. Sunny Africa, Executive Director of Ibon Foundation. You have the floor.
Good afternoon, Mr. Hello. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. I beg the chair's indulgence. We are a bit on the defensive, so we do want to be given that whole 10 minutes to state our case, please. We also shared a PowerPoint presentation, but there we go.
Please proceed.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. We do feel the need for change right now, that is a very real demand by many Filipinos. But we want to say that although Ibon can only speak for itself formally right now, we are in touch with the biggest networks of basic sectors organizations in the country, and they do share our position. Ibon Foundation's position is to oppose the proposed amendments to the economic provisions. The economic provisions of 87 Constitution are best retained and not subjected to any revisions or amendments. Economic chacha, we believe, is unnecessary, it distracts from real development, and is counterproductive. We think it is unnecessary because so many things can be done right now to uplift the conditions of our Filipino people and to help the economy. The economic chacha and opening up is unnecessary. We think it is distracting because the fixation on foreign investment distracts from the more basic changes in strategy. As I was telling my seatmate earlier, we do need a national industrialization policy which can be done better under the current constitution. And it is counterproductive because if we change the constitution, we will be losing a legal leverage precisely for the same kind of protective industrial policies that other countries are doing today, including advanced countries like the US, EU, Japan, China, and many other countries na nakatingala tayo. We strongly disagree that foreign investment is a magic bullet for development, and we do sometimes think that, sometimes things seem like common sense after being said for so long. But like when the world was shown to be round instead of flat, when confronted with facts, we do want to think that we can reconsider what we think is common sense. Could you please go back, please? We basically have three major points to help the Congress revisit the supposed common sense about the benefits of foreign investment. We will be presenting facts, one, on the supposed restrictiveness of the Philippines, secondly, on the supposed contribution to development of foreign investment, and third, on the supposed connection between restrictiveness and foreign investment. This first slide, I think, is quite important. It is wrong to look at just constitutions as the sign of restrictiveness, because in every country in the world, the foreign investment regime is a combination of the law of the land, the constitution, but also prevailing laws. If you look at the totality of constitutions and prevailing laws, the Philippines is actually now among the least restrictive economies of foreign investment in the region. This started with so many laws, starting with the Mining Act of 1995, which allowed 100% foreign ownership under an FTAA, all the way up to the recent laws of the opening public services. We strongly disagree with the notion that inflexibility is a problem. We think that is a wrong analogy. Hindi naman yoga yung economic policy making. If we need the country to regulate foreign investment, whether it's in ordinary law or the law of the land, the point is it needed or not? Flexibility is not something that will benefit economic policy making. And we do argue foreign investment restrictions are necessary. This chart shows foreign investment restrictions, not just in the Philippines, but in Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia. Also for fun, we put in China. I think very clearly, green shows sectors that are 100% open, that goes all the way from utilities to power to transport, retail, banking, finance, all the way to the end of mass media. You will notice that the Philippines has the most green boxes, meaning the Philippines now has the most open sectors to foreign investment. Our basic data sources for this are the World Bank, ease of investing across borders, the OECD Foreign Restrictiveness Index, the State Department investment climate statements, and actually we looked at the individual policy regimes of various countries. So categorically, it is untrue that the Philippines is restrictive. The Constitution is restrictive, but if you look at the totality of laws, the Philippines is among the least restrictive economies of foreign investment in the region. Next slide. Despite all the claims about foreign investment being small in the Philippines, it is true. The Philippines has less foreign investment than Singapore, Thailand, Indonesia, or Vietnam, but we have more foreign investment than Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos combined. And again, in the same way we disagree that flexibility is a virtue in itself, having more or less investment than others is not a measure of development. The real measure of development is if the foreign investment that comes in, has it helped the Philippines or not. In the case of the Philippines, foreign direct investment stock has grown 40 times since 1987 to $113 billion today. Measured as a share of GDP, it grew from 7.4% in 1987 to almost 30%, 28% in 2022. The question is, after so much foreign investment in the country, have we developed? Next slide, please. The next slide shows categorically, after decades of foreign direct investment, our fundamentals are unsound, our fundamentals have gotten worse. Manufacturing has fallen to its smallest share of the economy in 75 years, since 1949. Agriculture has fallen to its smallest share of the economy in its entire history. So categorically, we disagree that foreign investment that has come in has helped the Philippine economy. The next slide clearly shows foreign investment is 100% allowed in Filipino manufacturing. I think it should be a point of reflection, despite manufacturing being 100% open to foreign investment, why has Filipino manufacturing fallen to its smallest share of GDP in 75 years, 17.9% last year. Right now, the Philippines has the second smallest manufacturing sector among our ASEAN neighbors. This is despite about $17 billion in identifiable foreign investment being in manufacturing. Next slide, a bit of insight into the exact problem for that. There's a lot of hype about foreign investment coming in, but we take three examples of Intel, Hanjin, and Malampaya. These are three corporations that have cumulatively invested about $7 to $8 billion in the whole time they were here. But I think it should be very surprising or a point of interest that Intel, despite being in the country for 35 years, despite $1.5 billion in foreign investment, despite at some point giving over $5 billion in exports, and supposedly creating nearly 2,000 jobs, when they left the Philippines in 2009, there was no Philippine domestic electronics industry. Same goes for Hanjin, same goes for Malampaya. Foreign investment comes in, it makes its profits. That is what foreign investment does. It's not good or bad, it's not evil or an angel or a demon, but foreign investment is here to profit from the Philippines, not to develop the country. Without a proper foreign investment framework, such as by a national industrialization policy, foreign investment will come in without developing the Philippine economy. Next slide. Also, I think very alarming, in the Philippines, by various measures, the majority of manufacturing reported as manufacturing in the Philippines is not even Filipino. We look at various measures by the PSA, by the World Bank, even by the Business World Top 1,000 corporations. Foreign manufacturers take anywhere from 52 to about 71% of reported manufacturing in the Philippines. So most Filipino manufacturing isn't even Filipino. The next slide, there's always a claim that foreign investment creates job creation. Well, we argue that the statistics don't show that. Even if annual foreign investment inflows have been greatly increasing from about $1.5 to $2.5 billion annually in the mid-2000s to about 8 to 12 billion annually in the last 5 years, it is very noticeable that job creation in private establishments has actually fallen from an annual average of 520,000 in the mid-2000s to just about 400,000 today. This is also including, of course, the period of COVID, but the period of the COVID pandemic also saw record foreign investment in the country. Next slide. I will do this in the next 1 minute. I think this is an important point because if you look at the amount of foreign investment in the Philippines right now, the Philippine foreign investment stock is 28% of GDP. This is more foreign investment than South Korea, Taiwan, and China had in the 1970s and 80s during their period of economic takeoff. And actually, it is more foreign investment than in South Korea, Taiwan, and China today. So that argument that foreign investment is critical for development, that has not been the case in the Philippines. South Korea, Taiwan, and China did not primarily rely on foreign investment for their economic takeoff. They're not relying on it now. On the other hand, the Philippines has relatively more foreign investment, but is clearly much more backward. If you can jump to the next 2 slides. One more slide. Just one more, please. Sorry, next again. Okay. This may not be very clear, but the OECD Restrictiveness Index is always used as an example of how restricted the Philippines is. What Ibon did was we looked at UNCTAD data for annual foreign direct investment inflows and for total foreign direct investment stock. If it was true that taking away restrictiveness increases foreign investment, then presumably we would have seen a downward sloping line in terms of the more open, the more foreign investment. But in the biggest database we've seen of 81 countries by the OECD, it turns out that regardless of the level of foreign direct investment restrictions, foreign direct investment inflows on an annual basis in over 60 countries are in the 1 to 4% of GDP range. The point being, it wasn't actually the restrictiveness that affected the amount of foreign investment coming in. The next slide shows the same point, not just in terms of flows for 2019, the last pre-COVID result, but for total foreign investment stock, the exact same result. I think it should be very striking that an open country like Slovenia has less foreign investment than very close Libya. Germany actually has less foreign investment as a share of GDP than the Philippines, which is supposed to be close. Last point, we looked at the foreign direct investment restrictiveness index in major ASEAN countries, including the Philippines, in the next slide. And again, there is no clear universal correlation. In ASEAN, among our neighbors, there's no result that you reduce the restrictiveness, you increase foreign direct investment. Clearly, in the case of the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand, in 2 countries, as restrictions were reduced, there was a small increase in foreign direct investment as share of GDP. But on the contrary, in 3 countries, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand, as restrictions were reduced, foreign direct investment as a share of GDP actually fell. So we want to conclude with that point. There is no reason to change the constitution. If you want to develop the country, so much more can be done with the current constitution. If we think that foreign direct investment will automatically help the Philippines, that is not the case in our country or in many other countries. Last point, even changing the restrictiveness will not actually necessarily even increase foreign investment. So we're categorically opposed to the changes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sunny Africa, Executive Director of Ibon Foundation. Floor leader.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we recognize Professor Raul Fabella, Professor Emeritus of the UP School of Economics.
The chair would like to recognize Professor Raul Fabella, Professor Emeritus UP School of Economics via Zoom. Professor Fabella, please proceed.
The lower house. Hello?
Yes,
Can you
Professor,
hear me?
please proceed. We can hear you.
I would like to thank the leadership of the lower house and the community of the whole house for the invitation to share our humble illuminations in the matter. I support the lifting of Section 11, Article 12, and of the RBH. On the development experience of nations is that the development experience is that of all progress eventually boils down to investment, just as Secretary Balsahan alluded to. Specifically to the share of the national income that the nation sets aside for investment, what is called the investment rate. The share of investment spending in GDP. Countries that invest less will, over time, eat the dust of countries that invest more. That is the sad story of the Philippines. Countries' investment has to be financed. The first source of investment is, of course, domestic savings. A percent of GDP it sets aside for the future. Countries that save more have greater leeway for financing investment domestically. Countries that save less need more outside savings, foreign investment and borrowing, just to keep up. Investment has to be attracted by rules that reduce uncertainty and protect our property rights as much as is possible. Investment rate across the selected countries, especially the ASEAN, has the Philippines lowest in investment as percentage of GDP and as well as savings, 22%. It also has the lowest direct foreign investment. Vietnam is higher by about 10% on both counts than the Philippines. And it has, of course, about double the direct foreign investment. Note that the 2022 year that is bannered in the table that I have in my PowerPoint is itself typical of the Philippine experience in the last 40 years. The standard investment rate in the ASEAN is 25 to 35% in either account. We have privileged consumption over saving and investment as a nation. The government has been cheerleading the national consumption binge. Our government capital outlay is less than 5% of GDP for those 4 decades. It was between 6 to 10% of GDP among the ASEAN. We still have to breach the ASEAN standard. We are literally bottom feeders in the investment space. I have a slide which shows that we have literally been bottom feeders in the investment space. But I'm just going to go forward. Senator Grace Poe and erstwhile Supreme Court Justice Tony Carpio correctly pointed out in one hearing that we have already leapfrogged some constitutional hurdles through laws and amendments thereof, such as the PSA and the RTL. They are right. So why RB 87? Investors, of course, prefer stronger, credible commitment, especially from perceived weak governance countries. And of course, we are perceived as a weak governance country in the global ratings. Those are easier to reverse than constitutional provisions. The latter is therefore more valuable than laws as credible commitment device. The stronger the commitment device, the better investors feel about being in one locality. As was already mentioned, the Supreme Court is currently deliberating on whether the PSA law is actually constitutional. And the lifting of the 60-40 rule will improve the prospect of all economic activities, investments thereof, including those that have already been liberalized by the PSA, and not just education and telecommunications. In 2016, the Philippine Supreme Court, confirming an arbitral ruling, ordered the Philippine government to indemnify PIATCO 25 billion pesos. Had the ownership restriction not been there, Terminal 3 would have been run and earning since 2002, and the 25 billion indemnity would have been avoided. 25 billion pesos was then the cost of foreign ownership restriction in just one case. Now, you can say that ownership of airports is now liberalized by PSA. But as I've already mentioned, the credibility of laws is lower than the credibility of constitutional provisions for the protection of property and contracts. And in the next decade, PIATCO was actually the red flag that popped out in every screens in the global foreign investors' computers. And what did it say? It said, beware the Philippines. We are gifted by heaven with a national patrimony, but we abdicate our right if we fail to make this patrimony flower. Whoever, regardless of birth, whoever can make the land flower should have it by right. The gospel has a grim warning for those who bury their talents. And I quote, so take the talent from him and give it to him who has 10 talents, and cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. Matthew 25, 14 and 30. As a final word, let me repeat, I support the proposal to lift Section 11 of Article 12, and indeed all of other policy instruments masquerading as basic values in the 1987 Constitution. The framers of 87 Constitution seem to think that future lawmakers, present company included, won't have enough wisdom to weigh in on these weighty matters. I won't be guided by Saint Augustine of Hippo, who before conversion prayed thus, "Lord, make me chaste, but not yet," unquote. Instead, I take comfort from Voltaire, who said, "The perfect is the enemy of the good." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Raul Fabella, Professor Emeritus UP School of Economics. Floor Leader.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we recognize Ms. Hazel Parcon Santos, PhD, a researcher and an economist.
The Chair would like to recognize Ms. Hazel Parcon Santos. You have the floor.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and honorable members of the Congress. Before I proceed, I would like to state that the views I will express this afternoon are based on the empirical study that I co-wrote with my colleagues at the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, but do not represent the official position of the BSP. The title of our research is ASEAN 5 Countries in Competition for FDI. So this study was released to the public last December 2021 as a BSP discussion paper. In this study, we evaluated the possible factors that may help account for the disparities in foreign direct investments received by 5 countries that are members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, namely Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam, from 15 source countries for the period 2009 to 2019. In our study, we explain that foreign investors look at a wide range of factors in potential host countries, including but not limited to market size, business costs, human capital, macroeconomic stability, economic openness, governance, business regulations, and infrastructure. Given the main interests of the Congress this afternoon, I will briefly discuss the results of our empirical findings on the possible impact of FDI regulatory restrictiveness on a country's FDI position. In our study, we used the FDI Regulatory Restrictiveness Index as a measure of a country's economic openness. We obtained this index from the database of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD. To briefly explain, this index is a composite measure of 4 items. First is foreign equity restrictions. Second is discriminatory screening or approval mechanisms. Third is restrictions on employment of foreigners as key personnel. And fourth, other operational restrictions pertaining to FDI. Our empirical estimations show that the OECD sub-index on FDI equity restrictions is negative and statistically significant in 6 out of our 10 specifications. Since a higher index value indicates more restrictive regulations, this implies that reducing restrictions on foreign equity has the potential to increase foreign direct investments. However, in some specifications, when we considered factors such as a country's rule of law, infrastructure, and ease of doing business, specifically in trading across borders, the sub-index on FDI equity restrictions becomes statistically insignificant. This implies that these other factors could be more important in attracting more foreign direct investments. We conducted additional estimations using the overall FDI Restrictiveness Index and its other components, namely the sub-indices and restrictions on the employment of foreigners as key personnel and discriminatory screening or approval mechanisms. Results show that the overall FDI restrictiveness index is statistically insignificant for all investors when macroeconomic stability, governance, ease of doing business, and quality of infrastructure are accounted for. As an additional information, among the factors we examined and based on their respective coefficient estimates, the ease of doing business associated with trading across borders appears to be the most important determinant of FDI, at least for the group of source and host countries included in our study. We likewise find that foreign investors look at the country's quality of human capital, corporate taxes, infrastructure, governance, competitive industrial performance, and technological innovation. Our study is limited by the fact that aggregated FDI is used in these estimations. Thus, our estimates only reflect average effects. Different investors with varied investment motivations and with specific target sectors may have different sensitivities on the factors we considered. Our study suggests that there is no factor that can single-handedly attract foreign direct investments. A country can open its economy to foreign investors, but it must be accompanied by efficient business regulations, good governance, and improvements in infrastructure, among others. Potential host countries need to compete in different dimensions, and a combination of the different factors is required. For policy, this suggests that a holistic approach is needed to successfully attract and retain FDI. Let me end here. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hazel Parcon Santos. Floor leader.
Mr. Chair, I move that we recognize Mr. Rucher Lacaza, Supervising Legislative Staff Officer 3 of the Congressional Policy and Budget Research Department, House of Representatives.
Mr. Rucher Lacaza, Supervising Legislative Staff Officer 3 of CPRB. You recognize, you have the floor.
Hello. A pleasant afternoon to the House Speaker, to the Deputy Speakers, and to the House members. Today I will be presenting a CPBRD study titled Impact of Regulatory Barriers on Inward FDI in the ASEAN 5. So basically this study was inspired by a BSP paper presented earlier by Ms. Parcon Santos. The analysis here is undertaken by adopting her approach with a few adjustments, specifically an expanded set of FDI source countries, a different treatment of negative FDI inflows, and a period that extends 2020. So this study also examined a subset of the variables used by Parcon Santos. But basically, the main contribution of this paper is to provide empirical evidence on the impact of foreign equity restrictions on FDI inflows, and at the same time to provide a more detailed discussion on FDI restrictions across ASEAN, especially in the Philippines. All right, next slide, please. So from a highly restrictive and complicated investment regime, Philippines adopted a more open FDI strategy. So in 1991, the Philippines introduced the Foreign Service Act, signaling a shift towards a more open economy. In 1994, Philippines embarked on foreign bank liberalization. Fast forward to 2000, the Philippines implemented the retail trade liberalization. More recently, the Philippines introduced the CREATE Act, including the passage of the more important investment reform bills, such as amendments of the Philippine Service Act, Retail Trade Liberalization Act, and Foreign Investment Act. So these reforms have not only attracted FDI, but also stimulated economic growth and development. Next slide, please. Indeed, reforms, can you go back to the previous, please? All right. So indeed, the reforms, these reforms that liberalize FDI has improved FDI inflows. If you can see in the chart, cumulative FDI inflows grew from 12 billion US dollars in 1990 to 1999 to 16.3 billion in 2000 to 2009, then surged 58.6 billion in USD in 2010-29. And in just 3 years, it reached 28 billion USD from 2020 to 2022. So basically, FDI inflows in the Philippines have significantly improved over the past year, despite restrictiveness. However, despite growing FDI inflows, the Philippines continues to lag behind its neighbors in the region. So the Philippines ranked 6 out of 10 ASEAN countries in 2020. So despite being in the same region and sharing similar economic opportunities, the Philippine FDI net inflows have not seen the same level of FDI as countries like Indonesia and Vietnam. So in this study, we hypothesize that while we continue to invest in human capital, improve governance, and other important factors that attract FDI, we believe that there is a need to ease restrictions, regulatory restrictions on FDI to attract more foreign investment. Now, all right. So next slide, please. So to introduce you our variable of interest, we use the OECD FDI Regulatory Restrictiveness Index. So basically, it measures the level of restrictiveness of policies implemented in 85 countries. So restrictions are evaluated from 0, on a scale of 0 means open and 1 means closed. Now, it is important to note that the index assesses the restrictiveness of FDI policies in economy, not the overall attractiveness of a country as an FDI destination, sorry. All right, so what are the specific categories of regulatory restrictive? So we have the foreign equity limitations, screening and approval, key foreign personnel, and other restriction types. And as you notice, the majority of these restrictions stem from foreign equity, so the blue bar. Next slide, please. So, all right, so comparing ASEAN with the Philippines, over the years, Philippines has consistently ranked poorly relative to its peers on the FDI Regulatory Restrictiveness Index. So the most recent data for 2020 shows that the Philippine index is almost 3 times higher than the score of Vietnam, or almost 2 times higher than the average score of the ASEAN 5, excluding the Philippines. Next slide, please. So, as you notice, majority of the restrictions are in the form of equity restrictions, and Philippines being the most restrictive. As you notice, in 2020, foreign equity restriction sub-index stood at 0.30, representing 80% of the Philippines' overall score. So this is 2 times higher than its peers' scores on this single measure. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide. All right, so here we look into the FDI restrictions in the Philippines. And as you see, most of the sectors in 2020 are still high in terms of restriction, and it is mainly due to high equity restrictions. So here, media stands out as the most heavily restricted, followed by business services, transport, telecommunications, and the primary sectors, while manufacturing, financial services, and distribution experience the least restriction. Now, it is important to note that the data, the chart, only captures 2020. So legislative changes that happened beyond that are not captured, captured by the data. All right. Okay, so before we delve into the analysis, so next slide please, we had a correlation between FDI as a percentage of GDP and the index. And it seems that they are negatively correlated. Of course, visual inspection of correlation alone is not sufficient to determine the real impact of foreign investment restrictions on investment flows. But again, it's a good starting point of analysis. So to accurately assess the impact of foreign equity restrictions on FDI inflows, so just like Parcon Santos, it should be followed by a more rigorous modeling techniques. So next slide, please. All right, so here we adopted a gravity model approach, and here are the results. So In the standard gravity model, so GDP of the host country is actually positive and distance is negative, implying that larger market size of the host economy increases FDI, while greater geographical distance decreases FDI. Now, let's turn our attention to our variable of interest, which is the equity restriction. As you can see, the result is negative and statistically significant when considering market size, distance, macroeconomic stability, corporate tax rates, quality of human capital, and governance. So it is estimated that the introduction of reforms leading to a 10% reduction in level of foreign equity restrictions as measured by the index could potentially increase FDI by around 7.7% on average. So this is consistent with the earlier results that reducing FDI restrictions, especially in the restrictions on foreign entry, can potentially increase foreign investment. All right. Okay, in conclusion, easing regulatory barriers, specifically foreign equity restrictions, has the potential to attract FDI inflows and achieve economic growth. So this finding suggests that the policy makers may consider reviewing and revising foreign equity restrictions to foster a more welcoming and favorable investment climate for investors. Again, while easing restrictions on foreign ownership can attract FDI, it is important to recognize that it is not a standalone solution. It should be seen as just one component of a comprehensive set of reforms aimed at enhancing the country's attractiveness to foreign investors. Policymakers and investors should consider a range of other factors that can either attract or deter foreign investment, just like improvement in human capital, infrastructure, improvement in governance, and so on. So these factors should work hand in hand to maximize the potential for FDI inflows in the regions, especially in the Philippines. That's all. Thank you.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Floor leader.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we suspend consideration of the resolution of both houses number 7.
Is there any objection? There is none. Motion is approved. Floor leader, we will just suspend
Mr. Speaker, Mr.
the
Chairman.
hearing of the committee of the whole House, and we will have our plenary session. We'll just take up one very important matter. Then when we will adjourn the plenary session and we'll resume back again to our committee of the whole.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, in line with that, I move that we suspend the committee hearing of the committee as a whole.
There's a motion to suspend the hearing of the committee of the whole. Any objection? This hearing is suspended. We'd like to remind our resource persons to stay put. We will just have our regular session and take up very important matters, and after which, when we adjourn right away, after taking the very important matters, we will resume the committee of the whole House. The meeting of the committee of the whole House is now suspended.